My name is Helene, and I am 32 years old. I thought I knew everything about the man I married. 4 years of waking up beside him, 4 years of shared dreams and whispered promises in the dark. But that Thanksgiving, when I pulled into his stepfather's driveway and found Derek's car missing, when I saw Leonard standing alone on that porch with shadows in his eyes, I realized I had been loving a stranger. The house was too quiet. The air felt wrong. And what happened next changed everything. Before I share what I discovered that night, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If stories about family secrets and finding strength in the hardest moments speak to you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. What I discovered that night changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Derek and I met 6 years ago at a small book fair in downtown Philadelphia. I remember it was October, the kind of crisp autumn day when the leaves crunch beneath your feet and the air smells like possibility. I was browsing through a collection of vintage poetry books when I noticed him standing at the next table, completely absorbed in a worn copy of something by Hemingway. He had this way of holding the book gentle but focused, like the words inside were precious. Most men I had dated before were loud, always trying to fill silence with their own voices. Derek was different. When our eyes met across those stacks of forgotten stories, he smiled just a small lift at the corner of his mouth, but it felt like an invitation. Our first real conversation happened over coffee at a tiny cafe around the corner from the fair. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, his words were measured, thoughtful. He asked me questions about my work as a teacher, about the children I taught, about why I loved books. No one had ever seemed so genuinely interested in the small details of my life. By the time we finished our second cup, I knew there was something special about this quiet man with the kind eyes. Our first official date was a walk along the Schuylkill River. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and pink, and Derek told me about his job as a software engineer, how he loved solving problems, finding order in chaos. We talked for hours, losing track of time, until the streetlights flickered on. When he walked me to my car, he hesitated, then asked if he could see me again. I said yes before he even finished the question. The first time he told me he loved me, we were caught in a sudden rainstorm, laughing as we ran for cover under a bookstore awning. He looked at me with water dripping from his hair and said those 3 words like they were the most natural thing in the world. Our wedding was small, just close family and a few friends held in a garden behind a historic inn in the countryside. Derek's mother, Patricia, was there, elegant despite her fragile health, holding Leonard's arm as she walked to her seat. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, this blended family that had found its way to each other despite difficult beginnings. Derek had told me the basic story early in our relationship. His biological father died when he was young. His mother remarried Leonard when Derek was 6, and Leonard had raised him ever since. It seemed like a story of healing, of second chances. But there were things Derek never talked about. The details of his early childhood remained wrapped in silence, and whenever I asked, he would change the subject with practiced ease. I assumed it was simply too painful losing a father so young. I never pushed. I thought I was being respectful. Now I understand I was being naive. Leonard entered Patricia's life when Derek was barely more than a toddler in his memories. From what Derek shared in fragments over the years, the transition was not easy. A 6-year-old boy does not simply accept a new man in his mother's life, especially one who seems to be replacing a father he can barely remember. Derek told me once about the silent battles of those early years, how he would refuse to speak to Leonard at dinner, how he would hide in his room when Leonard tried to engage him. But Leonard never gave up. He was patient in a way that Derek said he did not understand until much later. Leonard took Derek fishing on Saturday mornings, taught him how to change a tire, helped him with math homework, even when Derek insisted he did not need help. Slowly, reluctantly, Derek's walls began to crumble. By the time Derek was 12, he had started calling Leonard Dad, not because anyone asked him to, but because it felt true. Leonard had shown up in all the ways that mattered. He was at every baseball game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference. When Derek struggled in high school, Leonard was the one who sat with him until midnight working through problems. When Derek got accepted to college, Leonard was the one who cried. Their bond seemed unbreakable. Patricia would often tell me how grateful she was that her two men had found each other, how Leonard had saved them both in ways she could never fully explain. But something shifted after Patricia passed away 3 years ago. The cancer took her slowly, giving us all time to say goodbye, but also time to watch her fade. Derek was devastated, of course, but his grief seemed to create a distance between him and Leonard that I could not understand. He stopped calling Leonard as often. He found excuses to skip holiday visits. When I asked him about it, he would just shake his head and say he needed space. I assumed it was the grief talking that he would find his way back to Leonard eventually. I never imagined there was something deeper, something buried beneath years of carefully constructed silence. My own impressions of Leonard were always positive. The first time I met him was at a family dinner about 5 months into my relationship with Derek. I was nervous, wanting so badly to make a good impression on the man who had raised the person I was falling in love with. Leonard greeted me at the door with a firm handshake and a warm smile. He was tall with the straight posture of a military man, but his eyes crinkled when he laughed, which he did often that evening. Patricia was lovely, asking me questions about my teaching and sharing stories about Derek as a child that made him groan in embarrassment. It felt like being welcomed into a family truly welcomed, not just tolerated. Over the years, Leonard always treated me like a daughter. He remembered my birthday, asked about my students, offered to help whenever Derek and I needed anything. When Patricia got sick, Leonard was a pillar of strength, caring for her with a devotion that moved me deeply. After she passed, I could see how lost he was in that big house, alone, surrounded by memories of the woman he had loved for nearly 3 decades. I tried to encourage Derek to visit more, to call more, but he always found reasons not to. It created a small tension between us, one I tried not to let fester. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be different. I was the one who suggested we spend the holiday at Leonard's house. It had been 3 years since Patricia's death, 3 years of Leonard rattling around in that Pennsylvania farmhouse by himself. I thought it was time to rebuild, to remind Derek that family meant showing up even when it was hard. To my surprise, Derek agreed without much argument. He even offered to go early to help Leonard prepare for the meal, to clean up the house and stock the kitchen. He took a few days off work, something he rarely did, and drove to Pennsylvania 2 days before I could join him. Those first messages from Derek were normal, even cheerful. He sent me photos of the grocery store haul jokes about Leonard's outdated taste in music, a selfie of the two of them attempting to assemble a folding table. I felt hope swelling in my chest. Maybe this was the healing we all needed. But then the messages changed. On the second day, Derek's responses became shorter. Busy, he would write, or just talk later. I tried calling, but he let it go to voicemail. I told myself he was just caught up in preparations, that there was nothing to worry about. Then came the call late the night before I was supposed to leave. It was almost 11 and I was already in bed, my suitcase packed by the door. Derek's voice was tight, strained in a way I had never heard before. He said we needed to talk when I arrived, that it was about Leonard and Patricia. When I pressed for details, he just said, "Things are complicated. Please just get here." Then he hung up, leaving me staring at my phone in the dark, my heart pounding with questions I could not answer. The drive from our home in New Jersey to Leonard's house in rural Pennsylvania usually takes about 4 hours. That day, it felt like an eternity. I left early in the morning, hoping to arrive by late afternoon, but traffic near the interstate was worse than expected, and I found myself crawling along at a frustrating pace. The whole drive, I kept replaying Derek's words in my mind. Things are complicated. What did that mean? What could possibly be so complicated about preparing for a family dinner? I tried calling Derek 3 times during the drive. Each call went straight to voicemail. I left messages trying to sound calm, telling him I was on my way, asking him to please call me back. The silence from his end felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he was in the middle of something important. but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was very wrong. To distract myself, I turned on the radio, but every song seemed to mock my growing anxiety. I switched to a podcast about history, but I could not focus on the words. Eventually, I drove in silence, watching the landscape change from crowded suburbs to rolling farmland, the trees stripped bare by early winter. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain that never came. By the time I turned onto the long gravel road that led to Leonard's property, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. Leonard's house was a 2-story colonial white with black shutters set back from the road on about 3 acres of land. Patricia had loved that house, had spent years filling it with antique furniture and family photographs and the kind of warmth that made you feel at home the moment you walked through the door. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed immediately that something was off. The garage door was open, but Derek's car was not inside. Only Leonard's old pickup truck sat in the shadowed space looking somehow abandoned. I parked and stepped out into the cold evening air. The house was quiet, too quiet for a home preparing for Thanksgiving. No sounds of cooking, no music, no voices, just the rustle of dead leaves across the lawn and the distant call of a bird. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up the porch steps, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Before I could knock, the front door swung open. Leonard stood there looking older than I remembered. His face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper, and there was a weariness in his posture that I had never seen before. He was wearing a flannel shirt and worn jeans, and his hands hung at his sides like he did not know what to do with them. For a long moment, he just looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. It was a mixture of sorrow and fear, and something else I could not name. "Where is Derek?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Leonard did not answer immediately. He stepped aside to let me in, and I walked into the house that had always felt so welcoming, but now seemed filled with shadows. The living room was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. There was no fire in the fireplace, no smell of turkey or pie, no signs of the festive preparation I had expected. He left Leonard finally said, his voice rough, like he had been crying. "This afternoon." He said he needed time to think, left to where I demanded. "What happened? What did you do?" Leonard flinched at my accusation, but he did not defend himself. Instead, he walked slowly to the old armchair by the fireplace and lowered himself into it like a man twice his age. He gestured for me to sit on the couch across from him. I remained standing, my heart hammering against my ribs. "There are things Derek found out," Leonard said quietly. "Things I should have told him years ago. Things Patricia and I kept from him because we thought we were protecting him." I stared at him, trying to understand. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, the last light of day faded to nothing. I became acutely aware of how alone we were in this house, how isolated the property was from neighbors in town. My phone was in my pocket, but Derek was not answering, and I did not know who else to call. What things I whispered. "What are you talking about?" Leonard closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were glistening with unshed tears. "Please sit down, Helene," he said. "This is going to take a while." I sat. Leonard asked me for a glass of water before he began, and I watched his hands tremble as he lifted the cup to his lips. This man who had always seemed so steady, so reliable now, looked like he might shatter at any moment. I waited, forcing myself to be patient, even though every nerve in my body was screaming for answers. Derek found some letters, Leonard started, in the attic. He was looking for the old Thanksgiving decorations, the ones Patricia used to put up every year. There is a box of them stored up there, and next to it was another box, one Patricia kept locked. The key has been in my dresser drawer for years. I suppose Derek found it while looking for something else. He paused, staring at a spot on the floor like it held all the secrets of the universe. I did not interrupt. I barely breathed. The letters were between Patricia and me. He continued. "From before we were married, from before her first husband died. I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. Before her first husband died, Derek's biological father. Thomas, I said, remembering the name Derek had mentioned only a handful of times, always briefly, always with a strange flatness in his voice. Leonard nodded. Thomas was not a good man, Helene. I know that sounds like something a person says to justify their actions, but it is the truth. He was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he became violent. Patricia lived in fear for years. She was too scared to leave because Thomas threatened to take Derek from her, said he had connections that would ensure she never saw her son again. My mind raced to catch up with what he was telling me. I had always assumed Derek's father died in some tragic but ordinary way, an accident, an illness. Derek never wanted to talk about it, and I had respected his silence. Now I was beginning to understand that silence had been a wall hiding something much darker. I met Patricia at a community support group, Leonard said. I was volunteering there after I left the army. She was trying to find a way out of her marriage, trying to find the courage. We became friends first. She would call me late at night when Thomas was passed out, and we would talk for hours. She told me things she had never told anyone, and I fell in love with her. He looked up at me, then his eyes pleading for understanding. I did not plan for it to happen. Neither of us did. But loneliness and fear and kindness can create bonds that defy logic. By the time we admitted our feelings to each other, we were already in too deep. So you were together, I said slowly before Thomas died. Leonard nodded miserably. For about 6 months. We were careful, or so we thought. We met in secret stole hours here and there when Thomas was at work or too drunk to notice. Patricia was trying to save money, trying to find a lawyer who would help her without tipping Thomas off. We had a plan. She was going to leave him, take Derek, start over somewhere safe. And then Thomas found out. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and insistent. There was a confrontation. Leonard continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas found one of my letters in Patricia's purse. He went into a rage. He hit her, threatened Derek, said he would kill her before he let her leave. Patricia called me terrified, and I told her to take Derek and get out immediately. I would meet them. We would figure out the rest later. What happened? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Thomas got in his car that night, drunk out of his mind and full of rage. He was coming to find me, I think, or maybe he was just driving with no destination looking for someone to hurt. He ran a red light and hit another car head-on. The other driver survived. Thomas did not. I sat back against the couch cushions trying to process the enormity of what I was hearing. Derek's father, the man Derek had been taught to mourn, had died in a drunken rage while hunting for the man who would become Derek's stepfather. And Derek had never known. For almost 30 years, he had believed a different story entirely. Patricia told Derek that his father died before the divorce was finalized, Leonard said. She told him that she and I met a year after Thomas passed, that our relationship was entirely separate from the tragedy. She wanted to protect him from the ugliness, from knowing that his father was a monster, from knowing that his death was connected to our love. She thought ignorance was kindness. But Derek found the letters, I said. Leonard nodded. All of them. Including the one I wrote the week before Thomas died, where I told Patricia that everything would be different once we could be together openly. The date on that letter made it impossible to maintain the lie anymore. I imagined Derek alone in that dusty attic reading words that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his childhood. The betrayal he must have felt not just from Leonard, but from his mother, the woman he had adored and mourned. How does someone survive that kind of revelation? What did Derek say when he confronted you? I asked. Leonard's face crumpled. He accused us of killing his father, said that if Patricia and I had not been sneaking around, Thomas would never have been in that car that night. He said we let him grow up mourning a man while hiding the truth about what that man really was. He said he could not look at me without seeing a lie. I wanted to defend Leonard, wanted to find some words of comfort, but I also understood Derek's pain. His entire history had been rewritten in the space of an afternoon. Every memory he had of his father, every story his mother had told him, was now tainted with deception. I tried to explain, Leonard said, his voice breaking. I tried to tell him that we were just trying to protect him, that Patricia agonized over this decision for years. She wanted to tell him when he turned 18, then when he graduated college, then when he got married. But she could never find the right moment, and then she got sick, and she was so focused on fighting the cancer that everything else fell away. Before she died, she made me promise to tell Derek the truth after she was gone. But I was a coward. I kept putting it off, convincing myself that enough time had passed that it did not matter anymore. But it did matter, I said quietly. It mattered to Derek. Leonard buried his face in his hands. I know, he whispered. God help me, I know. I sat in that dim living room watching this broken man wrestle with decades of buried guilt, and I felt my own anger rising. Not at Leonard exactly, but at the situation, at the secrets, at the way well-intentioned lies had poisoned an entire family. And beneath the anger, there was fear. Derek was out there somewhere alone with his shattered understanding of everything he had believed, and I had no idea how to find him. The hours crawled by. I called Derek again and again, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. I sent text messages, long ones pouring out my love and concern, begging him to let me know he was safe. The silence in response was deafening. By midnight, I had nearly worn a path in Leonard's living room carpet from pacing. Give him tonight, Leonard said from his chair where he had not moved for hours. I know my son. He needs to process things alone before he can talk about them. He has always been that way ever since he was a boy. What if he does something stupid, I demanded? What if he is not just processing? What if he is spiraling somewhere, making decisions he cannot take back? Leonard looked at me with old, tired eyes. Derek is stronger than you think, he said. Stronger than I think sometimes. He will not do anything rash. He just needs time to feel what he is feeling without anyone watching. I wanted to argue, wanted to jump in my car and search every road in Pennsylvania until I found my husband. But I also knew that Leonard knew Derek better than I did, in some ways had watched him grow from a wounded child into a capable man. So I forced myself to sit down to try to be patient, even though patience felt like torture. The night stretched on dark and endless. Leonard and I sat in that living room, two people connected only by our love for someone who was not there. He began to talk slowly at first, then with more detail, telling me things about Patricia that I had never known. She had been only 19 when she married Thomas, too young and too naive to recognize the warning signs. By the time Derek was born, she was trapped in a nightmare. Thomas controlled everything, the money, the car, even who she could talk to. He isolated her from her family, made her believe that no one would help her even if she asked. She tried to leave once, Leonard told me. When Derek was about 3, she packed a bag in the middle of the night and drove to her sister's house 2 states away. Thomas found her within a week. He charmed the sister, convinced everyone that Patricia was unstable, that she was the problem. He brought her back home, and after that, he made sure she knew what would happen if she ever tried again. I listened with a growing horror. This was not the story Derek had grown up with. He had been taught that his father was a flawed but ordinary man, someone to feel sad about, but not afraid of. The reality was so much darker. When Thomas died, Leonard continued. Patricia felt 2 things at once, relief and guilt. She was free, finally free, but a man was dead, and she could not shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible. She poured all of that complicated grief into protecting Derek. She decided he would never know the truth about what his father was about, the fear and the violence, and the nights she spent locked in the bathroom with a 3-year-old in her arms. She thought she was giving him a gift, I said, a clean memory. Leonard nodded. But clean memories are built on dirty foundations. The truth has a way of seeping through eventually. I thought about all the times Derek had seemed distant, the moments when he would stare into space with an unreadable expression. I thought about the nightmares he sometimes had, calling out names I did not recognize in voices full of fear. I had always assumed those were just random firings of a sleeping brain. Now I wondered if somewhere deep inside Derek's body remembered things his conscious mind had been forbidden to know. We talked until the sky outside the windows began to lighten from black to gray. Leonard showed me old photo albums, pages full of images I had never seen. Patricia as a young woman, painfully thin, with eyes that looked too large for her face. Derek as a toddler, clutching a stuffed bear with a death grip, never smiling in any of the early pictures. And then later, photos after Leonard entered their lives, and slowly, gradually, both Patricia and Derek began to look different. Lighter. Like people who had been released from a prison they could never name. "She loved you," I told Leonard, looking at a picture of Patricia on their wedding day, radiant in a simple white dress. "She loved you so much." Leonard touched the photograph with one weathered finger. "And I loved her," he said. From the first moment I heard her voice on the phone at 2 a.m, talking to a stranger because she had no one else. I loved her, and I let her down by keeping her secrets even after she was gone. We sat together as the Thanksgiving sun rose over Pennsylvania, two people bound by shared grief and waiting for the one person who could make any of it make sense. Somewhere out there, Derek was alone with truths that had broken his world, and all I could do was hope he would find his way back to us before those truths destroyed him completely. By 5 a.m, I could not sit still any longer. The gray light of dawn filtered through the curtains, and somewhere in the distance I heard a rooster crow from a neighboring farm. I stood abruptly, grabbing my car keys from the table where I had dropped them hours earlier. "I'm going to find him," I announced. "I cannot just sit here anymore." Leonard rose slowly from his chair, his joints protesting the movement. "There is a place," he said. "A lake about 20 miles from here up in the hills. Derek and I used to go fishing there when he was a teenager. Whenever he was upset about something, a bad grade, a fight with a friend, that is where he would want to go. He said the water helped him think." Hope surged through me. "Do you have directions?" Leonard nodded and described the route, a series of back roads and turns that led into the forested hills east of his property. He wanted to come with me. I could see it in his eyes, but I told him to stay. If Derek came back while I was gone, someone needed to be here. And truthfully, I was not sure Derek was ready to see Leonard's face. Not yet. The drive through the rural Pennsylvania landscape felt surreal in the early morning light. Mist clung to the valleys, and the bare trees looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward a sky that was just beginning to show hints of pale blue. I drove faster than I should have on those winding roads, my heart pounding every time I rounded a curve. What would I say when I found him? What could anyone say in the face of a revelation like the one he had experienced? After nearly 40 minutes of driving, I came over a ridge and saw the lake spread out below me, its surface glassy and still in the windless morning. And there at the edge of a gravel parking area was Derek's car. I pulled up beside it and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. Then I got out and walked toward the water. The lake was ringed by pines and oaks, their branches bare, except for a few stubborn brown leaves that refused to let go. A wooden dock extended about 30 feet into the water, weathered gray by decades of sun and rain. And at the end of that dock, sitting with his legs dangling over the edge, was my husband. He looked smaller somehow, hunched in his jacket against the cold. He did not turn when he heard my footsteps on the wooden planks. He just kept staring out at the water, still as a statue. I walked slowly, giving him time to acknowledge me or tell me to go away. He did neither. When I reached him, I lowered myself to sit beside him, our shoulders almost touching. The cold from the wood seeped through my jeans immediately, but I did not complain. I just sat there with him, looking out at the lake that had witnessed so many of his private struggles over the years. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the lap of water against the dock pilings, the distant call of geese flying south, the rustle of dry leaves somewhere in the trees behind us. I wanted to reach for him, to take his hand, to somehow physically pull him back from whatever dark place his mind had gone. But I sensed that he needed to break the silence himself. He needed to choose to let me in. Finally, without looking at me, Derek spoke. My whole life was a lie, Helene. Everything I believed about my family. His voice was raw, scraped empty by hours of solitary anguish. I did not try to contradict him or minimize his pain. I just sat quietly listening. They made me mourn a monster, he continued. Every Father's Day, every anniversary of his death, I felt guilty that I could not remember him better. I felt guilty that Leonard felt more like a father to me than the man who gave me life. And the whole time they knew. They knew what he was, what he did, and they let me carry that guilt anyway. He turned to look at me then, and I saw tears streaming down his face. My strong, stoic husband, who I had never seen cry except at his mother's funeral, was weeping openly in the cold November air. The letters, Helene. You should have seen them. My mother wrote about hiding in the closet with me when he came home drunk. She wrote about the bruises she had to cover with makeup. And Leonard wrote about wanting to save her, about counting the days until they could be together openly. They were having an affair while my father was alive, and then he died because he found out, and they just buried all of it. They built our whole family on a graveyard of secrets. I reached out then, unable to hold back any longer, and took his hand in both of mine. His fingers were ice cold, but he did not pull away. He gripped my hands like they were the only thing tethering him to reality. I remember things he whispered, things I thought were just bad dreams, hiding under my bed while someone yelled, the smell of whiskey and something metallic, a hand raised not toward me but toward her. I thought I was making it up, filling in gaps with imagination, but those were real, were they not? Those were memories she tried to make me forget. I do not know, I said honestly, but I know your mother loved you more than anything. Whatever choices she made, whatever truths she hid, she was trying to protect you from pain she did not think you could handle. She was wrong, Derek said bitterly. Not knowing did not protect me. It just made me build my identity on a foundation of lies. I spent my whole life trying to be nothing like Thomas, trying to be patient and kind and steady, because I thought those were the ways I differed from a tragic but ordinary man who died too young. But he was not tragic. He was a monster. And maybe the things I hated about myself, the anger I sometimes feel, the darkness that scares me, maybe those came from him and I never knew to watch for them. His words hit me hard. I had seen flashes of that anger he mentioned, moments when Derek would retreat into cold silence, when his jaw would clench and his eyes would go distant. I had always attributed it to stress, to the normal frustrations of life. But now I saw those moments differently, saw them as a man fighting against shadows he did not even know were there. You are not your father, I said firmly. You are not Thomas. The fact that you worry about this, the fact that you have spent your whole life trying to be good and patient and kind, that proves you are nothing like him. Monsters do not worry about being monsters, Derek. They just are. He looked at me, searching my face for something. Reassurance, maybe. Or judgment. I do not know. I tried to let my love show in my eyes, to make him see that whatever he was feeling, I was there to feel it with him. How do I forgive them? He asked, his voice cracking. How do I look at Leonard and not see a liar? How do I visit my mother's grave and not feel betrayed? I did not have an easy answer. Forgiveness was not something that came on demand, not something that could be reasoned into existence. But I shared with him something I had learned in my own life, something I had never talked about much, because it still carried its own weight of complicated emotions. When I was 16, I found out my father was not my biological father. I told Derek. His eyes widened in surprise. I had never told him this before, and I saw him realize that even after 4 years of marriage, there were still secrets between us, small ones, but secrets nonetheless. My mother had an affair before I was born, and the man who raised me was not the man who gave me his DNA. I found out by accident, overheard a conversation I was not supposed to hear. Derek was watching me intently now, his own pain momentarily set aside by curiosity about mine. "What did you do?" he asked. I was furious, I admitted. I felt exactly what you are feeling now. Betrayed, lied to, like my whole identity was built on sand. I barely spoke to my mother for almost a year. It was the worst time in our relationship, and it hurt both of us so much. "But you got past it," Derek said. "You and your mom are close now." I nodded. I did get past it. Not quickly and not easily. But eventually, I realized something. My mother was not trying to hurt me by keeping that secret. She was trying to give me a normal childhood, a father who loved me without the complication of biology, a family that felt whole. She was wrong to hide it, but she was wrong out of love, not malice. And when I finally understood that I was able to let go of the anger, not forget it, not pretend it never happened, but release its hold on me. Derek was quiet, processing my words. Around us, the morning continued to unfold. The mist was lifting from the lake, revealing the far shore with its cluster of summer cabins now empty for the winter. A fish jumped somewhere in the deeper water, leaving ripples that spread outward in concentric circles. "I do not know if I can do that," Derek finally said. "Let go of the anger." "You do not have to do it today," I replied. "You do not even have to want to do it today. You just have to be willing to consider that someday you might be ready. That is enough for now." He looked at the lake for another long moment, then slowly turned to face me fully. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale and drawn, but there was something different in his expression now. The devastation was still there, but beneath it I saw a flicker of something that might have been resolution. "I need to go back," he said quietly. "I need to talk to him. Leonard. I do not know what I am going to say, but I cannot hide from this forever." I squeezed his hand. "Then let us go," I said. "Together." He nodded and we both rose to our feet. My legs were stiff from the cold, but I barely noticed. As we walked back down the dock toward our cars, Derek stopped and turned to look at the lake one more time. "This was where Leonard taught me to fish," he said. "Right off this dock. I was 8 years old and I had never held a fishing rod before. Thomas never took me fishing, never took me anywhere. Leonard was the one who showed me how to bait a hook, how to cast, how to wait patiently for something to bite. He sat with me for hours that first time, even though I was terrible at it. Never got frustrated, never gave up. I stood beside him, letting him have this moment of remembrance. "Leonard is still that man," I said gently. "Whatever else is true, he is still the person who taught you patience and love and how to be a good man. That does not get erased by what you learned yesterday." Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but then his shoulders dropped slightly, and some of the rigid tension left his body. "You are right," he admitted. "I hate that you are right, but you are. Let us go home." We drove back to Leonard's house in separate cars, Derek following me along those winding country roads. I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure he was still there, half afraid he might change his mind and disappear again. But he stayed behind me the whole way, a steady presence in my mirror, and when we finally pulled into the driveway, I felt something loosen in my chest. Whatever happened next, at least we were facing it together. Leonard was standing on the porch when we arrived, as if he had been waiting there for hours. Maybe he had. His face, when he saw both cars pull in, was a complicated mixture of hope and fear, like a man bracing for impact even while praying for mercy. Derek got out of his car slowly, not rushing, not hanging back. He walked up the porch steps with the deliberate gait of someone approaching a difficult task that could not be avoided. I stayed by my car, giving them space. This was their conversation, their reconciliation or confrontation or whatever it needed to be. I would be there if Derek needed me, but first they needed to face each other without an audience. They stood about 3 feet apart, father and son, stepfather and stepson, whatever the labels two men bound by, decades of shared life, and now divided by truth, finally spoken. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The morning had turned bright by now, sunlight slanting across the frost-covered lawn, and somewhere in the bare branches above, a cardinal was singing its sharp, clear song. Then Derek spoke. "I am angry." He said, his voice steady but strained. "I may be angry for a long time." Leonard nodded, accepting this. "I understand," he replied, "but you are still my dad." Derek's voice cracked on the last word. "That has not changed." Something broke in Leonard's expression, then all the careful control he had been maintaining crumbling into raw emotion. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks, and his hands trembled at his sides. He started, then stopped, unable to continue. He tried again. "I wanted to tell you so many times. Every birthday, every milestone, I thought about it. But then I would see how happy you were, how well you were doing, and I convinced myself that the truth would only cause pain. I was trying to protect you, Derek. I know that does not make it right, but I need you to know that." Derek stood rigid, and I could see the battle playing out on his face, the anger warring with the love, the betrayal clashing with decades of good memories. Finally, something seemed to give way inside him, and his shoulders dropped. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you were trying to protect me. That is what makes this so hard. I cannot even hate you properly because I understand why you did it. And I cannot forgive you easily because understanding is not the same as acceptance." Leonard nodded again, accepting even this. "I will take whatever you can give," he said, "however long it takes." They stood there for another moment, two men on the edge of something that could not be named. Then Leonard opened his arms, a tentative gesture, an invitation that Derek was free to refuse. And Derek, my husband, who had spent the last day wrestling with demons he never knew existed, stepped forward into that embrace. They held each other on that porch in the November sunlight, and I watched through tears of my own as something began to heal. It was not a perfect reconciliation. There would be more conversations, more arguments, more difficult truths to navigate. But it was a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both wiping their eyes, Leonard looked over at me, still standing by my car. "Come inside," he called. "Both of you. We have a Thanksgiving dinner to make." I walked up the porch steps and joined them, slipping my hand into Derek's. Together, the three of us entered the house that had held so many secrets for so many years. The kitchen was cold and empty, nothing prepared, nothing started. It was already afternoon by now, far too late for the elaborate feast that had originally been planned. But Leonard started pulling things from the refrigerator, a small turkey that could be roasted quickly, potatoes, for mashing cans of cranberry sauce and green beans. We worked side by side, the three of us chopping and stirring and seasoning. It was not the Thanksgiving any of us had imagined. The table was set for 3 instead of the larger gathering we had hoped for. The dishes were simple and hastily prepared. But as we sat down together and Leonard said grace, his voice thick with emotion, I felt something profound in that room. We were a family, damaged, complicated, held together by imperfect love and hard-won truths, but still a family. During the meal, Leonard began to share stories about Patricia that Derek had never heard. The way she laughed at bad jokes, her habit of singing off-key in the shower, the secret chocolate stash she kept in the back of the pantry. Derek listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, absorbing these new memories of the mother he thought he knew. And slowly, gradually, the atmosphere in the room shifted from grief to something gentler. Not quite peace, but the possibility of peace. By the time we finished eating, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We cleared the table together, washed the dishes together, moved through the rituals of domesticity that bind families, even in the hardest times. And when Derek took Leonard's hand and said a simple, "Thank you, Dad," the look on Leonard's face was something I will never forget. It was the look of a man who had been drowning for years and had finally found solid ground. Derek and I stayed with Leonard for 3 more days after Thanksgiving. Each day brought new conversations, some easier than others. Derek asked questions about Thomas, about Patricia, about the early years of their relationship. Leonard answered everything honestly, holding nothing back anymore. There were moments of tension, times when Derek had to leave the room to compose himself, but there were also moments of unexpected grace, a shared memory that made them both laugh, a photograph that sparked stories instead of pain. Before we left, Derek sat with Leonard one final time. They were on the back porch looking out at the fields that Patricia had loved so much, the land where she had finally found peace after years of fear. I watched from the kitchen window, giving them privacy, but unable to look away. "I forgive you, Dad," I heard Derek say, his voice carrying faintly through the glass. "Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger will only hurt me. Mom would not have wanted that. And honestly, neither do I." Leonard bowed his head, overcome. When he looked up again, his eyes were bright with tears, but also with something that looked like hope. "I do not deserve this," he said. "Maybe not," Derek replied. "But forgiveness is not about deserving. It is about choosing freedom over chains. And I choose freedom." They embraced again, longer this time, and I turned away from the window to give them their moment. When they came back inside, there was a lightness between them that had not been there before. Not everything was resolved. Healing would take months, maybe years. But the foundation had been laid. The drive back to New Jersey was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. Derek held my hand across the console, his thumb tracing patterns on my skin. Halfway home, he spoke. "I want to start seeing someone," he said, "a therapist. There is a lot I need to work through, not just about Leonard and Mom, but about the memories that are starting to come back, about Thomas. I think I have been carrying more than I realized." I squeezed his hand. "I think that is a wonderful idea," I said, "and I will be right here, whatever you need." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed it. "I do not know what I would have done without you, Helene. You came looking for me when I was lost. You sat with me on that dock without demanding anything, without judging. You just loved me. That means more than I can say." We arrived home as the last light of day faded from the sky. Our little house looked exactly the same as it had when we left, but everything felt different now. We were different. We understood each other in ways we had not before, and our marriage, which I thought was already strong, had deepened into something richer and more resilient. In the weeks that followed, Derek began therapy, slowly unpacking the trauma he had buried for decades. He called Leonard every week, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for hours. Their relationship was being rebuilt one conversation at a time, and watching it happen was like watching a garden grow after a long winter. I learned things about myself, too, during that time. I realized I had been afraid of difficult conversations, had accepted surface explanations rather than pushing for deeper truths. I promised myself I would not make that mistake again, not in my marriage, not in my life. 1 year later, we returned to Leonard's house for Thanksgiving. This time the kitchen was warm with cooking smells when we arrived, and Leonard greeted us at the door with genuine smiles instead of shadows in his eyes. We brought news that made the celebration even sweeter. I was pregnant with our first child. That evening, as we sat around the table and Leonard said grace, I looked at my husband holding his stepfather's hand, both of them with tears in their eyes, and I felt the weight of everything we had survived and the hope of everything yet to come. Derek caught my eye across the table and smiled, and in that smile I saw the future. A family that knew each other's scars and loved each other anyway. A legacy of truth instead of secrets. After dinner, as we cleaned up together, Derek paused with a dish towel in his hand and looked out the window at the darkening sky. I am going to tell our child everything he said quietly, when they are old enough. About Thomas, about Mom and Leonard, about all of it. I never want them to carry the weight of secrets the way I did. I wrapped my arms around him from behind, resting my cheek against his shoulder. I think that is exactly right, I said. And whatever stories we will tell them together. He turned in my embrace and kissed me softly. Together, he repeated, always together. Some truths break us before they set us free, but broken does not mean destroyed. Sometimes it is just the beginning of becoming whole again. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed how you saw everything? How did you find your way through? Share your experience in the comments below because we all have stories that deserve to be heard. If this video resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. Do not forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss another story of strength, healing, and finding light in the darkest places. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this community. May your family be blessed with honesty, your heart be filled with forgiveness, and may you always find the courage to choose freedom over chains. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.